That's okay. First of all, thank you all for coming down to this talk. It means a lot to see people come out on their Wednesday afternoons to these talks, because if people don't come, we don't put them on. So it's good to see. All I'm going to do now is to warmly welcome and introduce our speaker for this afternoon, Dr. Dan Bulley. Dr. Bulley is a senior lecturer in international relations here in the School of Politics, International Studies and Philosophy at Queen's. He has authored numerous journal articles on the ethics of foreign policy, particularly of British governments, including a 2009 book published by Routledge entitled Ethics as Foreign Policy, Britain, EU and the Other. And more recently, his interests have spread to the practices and possibilities offered by hospitality as a way of welcoming others, but also as a method of management and control. His talk today, entitled Occupy Everything, Resistance and Hospitality in Occupied London, will examine the tensions brought forth by the use and practices of hospitality. For example, by its resistance to, yet reliance upon, capitalism, for example. And if you have any questions, please do jot them down, and we will get to them at the end or something like that. But yeah, without further ado, I'd like you all to give a warm welcome to Dr. Dan Bulley.
Right, well, first of all, thanks to Connor for inviting me to give the talk. It's very useful, especially because this talk is going to form the basis for a paper to the school next week and a conference paper I've got to give in a couple of weeks' time in San Francisco for me. So this is really useful and it'd be good to see how it goes and what you guys think. So Occupy isn't something I'd naturally look at, right? I first became interested in it when I started to make connections between my own research agenda on hospitality and ethics and what was emerging in this kind of form of political resistance in 2011. I became most interested in it through this figure of Giles Fraser, the Reverend Giles Fraser. Does anybody remember him? Yeah. Okay, so he was the Canon Chancellor of St Paul's Cathedral, whose kind of intervention in the Occupy movement became really key to Occupy London, or Occupy the London Stock Exchange, in October 2011. So I couldn't make any kind of connection between what I was doing in my research and Occupy until this guy comes along. So I'm going to kind of tell you the story of him just before and how he got involved just before getting into the rest of it. The Canon Chancellor Giles Fraser turns up on the 16th of October to open the cathedral to welcome in the kind of congregation who are coming in for the 8 a.m. Mass, right? So what he's met with is this kind of massive group of protesters who've kind of descended overnight. So on the 15th of October, the day before, this a couple of thousand, I think, protesters turn up and try and gain access to Paternoster Square. Now, if you don't know the geography of London, this is St Paul's Cathedral. I didn't know the geography of this area, to be honest. But that's Paternoster Square, and that's the London Stock Exchange, okay? So the protesters come and they try and get into Paternoster Square. And as you can see, it's really easily defendable because it's got narrow entrances. So the police just blockade it. They know it's going to happen. They blockade it, and the protesters can't get in. They can't occupy the London Stock Exchange. So instead, they end up outside St Paul's Cathedral, okay? Almost by accident. So Giles Fraser rocks up and he tries to open the church. But what he's got are a kind of police cordon on the steps of St Paul's. Okay, so what he does is, in order to try and get the cathedral open for the communion, he asks the police to step off the steps of St Paul's along with a few protesters, and that's kind of met with cheers from the protesters. Okay, he's then asked by the protesters whether he supports the peaceful protest that they're partaking in, and he says yes, he does support them. He supports their right to protest, and they take that as a invitation to stay where they are, right? An invitation into the kind of space of St Paul's that they're already occupying. Okay. Now, the protesters will later really back Giles Fraser in this kind of Facebook movement to try and save him when he has to resign his position. They also did a collection to thank St Paul's for their hospitality, right? But it never got delivered to St Paul's because before it got delivered, the Dean of St Paul's asked them to move on, right? And the chapter of St Paul's voted that they should be evicted. So they never got invited in. But this guy is literally applauded by the protesters as he asked the police to step off the steps to St Paul's. So for me, through this guy's story, Occupy becomes this kind of a political phenomenon which kind of embodies the interaction between ethics, resistance, in and through hospitality. Okay? And that's because any kind of public spectacle of resistance, anything that you do in terms of publicly resisting something, demands and requires public space in which to act it out. If you think about flag protests, the anti-Iraq war protests, everything demands public space in which to act it out. Okay? Now that might not universally be the case, okay? Because if you think the role of social media now might reduce the need for public space, but for the Occupy movement, it is absolutely central. Occupy requires public space, okay? So Judith Butler observes, it's literally got public space at its core, okay? Occupy tries to occupy everything, okay, in protest at the crimes and misdemeanors of global capitalism. And obviously, Paternoster Square makes sense as a space to occupy because of its proximity to the London Stock Exchange, okay? It's a sensible choice. And these guys, these protesters, are using public space there. According to David Harvey's Marxist geographer, who uses the older Marxist geographer Henri Lefebvre to say, Occupy is about exercising a right to the city, okay, in protest at its undemocratic, exploitative nature. But obviously here they're met by trying to get into Paternoster Square, they're met by the coercive hostility, literally the opposite of hospitality, the coercive hostility of the police, right? So it challenges their peaceful movement. So just as Occupy Wall Street doesn't end up occupying Wall Street, right? Occupy Wall Street occupies Zuccotti Park, which obviously isn't Wall Street. These guys don't end up occupying the London Stock Exchange, they end up occupying St Paul's. Okay, because they require the space to be hospitable. It can't be just public space, it has to be an open, welcoming public space that grants them admittance, unlike Wall Street and unlike Paternoster Square. So had Giles Fraser denied them access, had he asked them to move on, and asked the police to enforce that, they might have had to do so. Okay, so they relied on that hospitality in order to conduct their protest and their resistance. Now, Giles Fraser's ability to resist or to kind of throw them out of the space was limited by the fact that they'd already taken up residence. Okay, they'd already assumed the hospitality of St Paul's. Okay, so this leads to the kind of paradox or the kind of dual aspect, the doubleness. Bernard Harcourt talks about occupying to occupy containing a certain doubleness. Okay, and that's due to this fact that they've already taken up residence. Okay, so the verb to occupy means, on the one hand, it means to dwell, to reside, or inhabit. Okay, it's the art of living or making a home. Okay, and in this sense, as those of you who take my third year course are very well aware, occupation is about your ethos. Okay, it's an ethical activity. If it's about your ethos, it's about ethics. Okay, and that fact of it being about your ethos, about your way of being, connects it kind of interminably to this issue of hospitality. So this quote that I always use from Derrida in all my papers and the like, this is from, for those of you who don't know, the French philosopher Jacques Derrida. He says, hospitality is culture itself, and not simply one ethic amongst others. Insofar as it has to do with the ethos, that is the residence, one's home, the familiar place of dwelling, inasmuch as it is a manner of being there, the manner in which we relate to ourselves and others, to others as our own or as foreigners, ethics is hospitality. Ethics is so thoroughly coextensive with the experience of hospitality. So your ethos, your way of being, is totally connected to the way you relate to yourself and to others, your ethics, okay? So our manner of occupying space, our manner of dwelling, is residing in space, is about how we relate to ourselves and to others. It's about hospitality. Okay? So our inclusion or exclusion of the other, the stranger, the way we include or exclude them, and the way we exercise power over them through that inclusion and exclusion. They're all practices of hospitality, even if you reject them, okay? Even if it's you show hostility to the other, just as the police did. That's an expression of an ethos, our manner of being, okay? And our occupying of space, okay? So what I'm kind of claiming is that Occupy London is enacting or producing a critical ethos, okay? A critical way of being. And that notion of a critical ethos connects to what Michel Foucault talks about as critique, okay? The way of countering the way we're governed, okay? The way of countering and resisting how we're taught to behave or how we're managed, how our behavior is managed, okay? So Occupy's way of being and dwelling therefore enacts a form of resistance which constitutes this critical ethos, these counter-conducts, this resistance towards the management of ourselves and others. Okay, and I'm going to come back to that later, this kind of key point. But of course, Occupy has this double sense, has this other meaning, okay, which is to do with violence. Okay, to occupy also means to seize the space of another, okay, to conquer it and to subjugate it. So that would be the case when we talk about the occupation of Iraq or the occupation of colonized territories. Okay, occupation there is a violent colonial move. And that kind of violence is as much a part of the action of occupying as pacifism. Okay, so Occupy is violent as well as pacific. Okay, and in a sense, that kind of violence obviously undermines its pacific nature. Okay, so Occupy's decision to seize the space outside St. Paul's without any kind of request until it had already done so, to arrive in the night and kind of subjugate the space without invitation. That's a kind of violation of the hospitality of public space. Okay. So it's specifically a violation of the hospitality of the chapter of St. Paul's. Yeah. Now the irony here is that Christianity as a religion, as some of you are aware, no doubt, stresses the role and importance of hospitality to strangers. And this is why you get these key banners saying, "What would Jesus do?" Okay. So this fact of the hospitality of Christianity is really well appreciated by the protesters. So they not only seize the space of St. Paul's, they seize the ethos of Christianity, okay, and they turn it against the church in order to kind of preserve their occupancy, okay. Now there's an irony to all this, of course, because hospitality in the Bible is far from kind of univocal or unproblematic. So I don't know how well you know your Old Testament, but a couple of key stories of hospitality from the Old Testament. You've got Lot, who's living in Sodom and welcomes in a couple of angels, and you've got the Levite of Ephraim, who welcomes in some strangers in Judges. Okay, now both of those stories end with rape and murder. Okay, so it's not all happy. Okay, so there's always violence at the heart of this kind of movement towards hospitality and Christianity as well. But the genius of this seizing of space or occupying this particular space is that this area outside St. Paul's is characterized by a kind of complex legal ownership. Okay, it's not owned just by St. Paul's, this area. It's not owned by the dean or the chapter of St. Paul's. It's not just them who have a right to grant or refuse entry. So Paul Ridge, who's a lawyer, he's a senior partner at the London Civil Liberties law firm Bindmans, he says that Occupy actually had quite a decent legal argument for a while, in that British courts have long recognised, he says, the right to gather and assemble in public space, and at the same time there are legal intricacies around this case because the land surrounding St. Paul's is not under single ownership. Okay, so that means the relevant landowners had to act together. So this space was owned by St Paul's and jointly by the City of London Corporation. Okay, so they had to act together, and that kind of caused some problems because the City of London Corporation wanted to evict them. The cathedral wasn't quite so sure, so it took them a long time to act together. And then the church kind of withdrew from its initial attempts to get rid of them. You had a similar thing with Occupy Wall Street, right? Zuccotti Park. The great thing about Zuccotti Park is that it is not simply a public space. It has a strange legal status. It's a privately owned public space. Okay, so their seizure of that was going to be fundamentally different if they tried to seize Times Square. Okay. Now the question becomes then, what makes this Occupy London an interesting kind of thing to study, right? Because obviously it hasn't led to any discernible change, Occupy London, Occupy Wall Street either. Certainly not comparable to the occupation of Tahrir Square in Egypt or other kind of spaces in the Arab Spring. Okay, so you kind of question, are we focusing on it purely because it's a kind of Western obsession taking place in kind of big Western cities? And of course that is part of it. You can't kind of deny that. But there's something more significant going on, I reckon. Okay, and I reckon you can get to it from this quote by Stuart Lee. Does anyone know Stuart Lee? He's a comedian, British comedian. Yeah, okay, it's quite funny. But anyway, so he writes in the Occupied Times that the Occupy movement is occupying space and time. Well done. In doing so, it has thus far changed the news agenda, shown how random groups of people can cooperate to noble ends, and some abuse about Rees-Munch. But global capitalism has moved beyond space and time into a theoretical abstract region unfettered by the laws of either physics or common decency, and where there isn't so much as a paving slab to pitch your tent on, let alone a Starbucks, okay? So this quote, I reckon, really nicely gets to the kind of futility of what Occupy is doing, but some of us, kind of the way we see it, right? It looks like such a small and misguided thing, right, to do in relation to the enormity of global capitalism, which, as he said, is unfettered by space and time, right? It's not like Occupy, which focuses on space and time. Now, I reckon this is, it's interesting, but it's fundamentally problematic, and it's why Occupy is something we should focus on. Okay, so the basic idea that capitalism is kind of beyond space and time is fundamentally problematic. It sets capitalism up as some kind of godlike, transcendent kind of force, which of course it isn't. That's clearly nonsense. Okay, so the significance of Occupy London and Occupy Wall Street especially is that unlike many of the other attempts to occupy everything, these protests have focused on global cities. Okay, they focus on the places where, as Saskia Sassen says, global capitalism literally comes down to ground. Okay, so these are spaces like New York, London, Frankfurt, Paris, Tokyo. Okay, they're what Sassen calls the nodal points of command and control in the global flows of capital, people, finance and wealth, okay, commodities and the like. So these cities like London and New York have a key management function, okay? And that management function, that the command and control that they exercise in the global economy, leads to key changes in the kind of urban fabric of these cities. The flows of capitalism literally come down to ground and affect the urban fabric of the cities themselves. Okay. Now, we can't overstate the importance of global cities within the within the flows of globalization, but spaces such as London Square Mile and Wall Street are clearly important, and they clearly operate within space and time. Okay, so they're a direct kind of riposte to the likes of Stuart Lee's claims. Okay, and there are certainly kind of problems with the global city thesis. So someone like Dorian Massey points out a number of fairly big problems with this idea of the global city. But what's most important, perhaps, is not whether they actually do have the effect that someone like Saskia Sassen says, but the kind of performative role they play. Okay, so the idea or identity of London as global city plays an important part in how we understand London, okay, and how it represents itself to the rest of the world and to the rest of the UK. So, as Doreen Massey says, Doreen Massey, by the way, is a key political geographer. She says there's a question of more than economics here. It's more than an issue of economics. It's fundamentally a performative claim, this idea of a global city. Okay, she says it set the scene for a shift in the whole way of being of London. Okay, and the idea of the global city has become a claim and a legitimation. Okay, regarding London's ethos. Okay, its way of being, its culture, its manner of existing. Okay, so this idea of the global city has become something London performs as part of its identity. So London practices this ethos, its ethics, a way of being in relation to itself and others through the notion of the global city, through its claim to being the global city. And it does claim, if you read London publications, they're all about claiming they are the major global city, far and above New York, Hong Kong, Tokyo, and the like. Okay. Now, a key role for global citydom, if you like, is that they enable flows and circulation globally. Okay, so these global flows and circulations that are illustrated by that kind of diagram, they enable and mobilize those flows. But crucially, they also enable and mobilize local circulation based on consumption. Okay? So the local circulations of the city, the global city, kind of are part of and embedded within these global networks as well. So for Saskia Sassen, this is a key point. Global cities become generators of demand. Okay? They're key generators of consumption and circulation. And this leads to kind of some research by Glaser, Conco, and Sayers, okay, who are, again, urban geographers. And they claim that there are 4 key requirements, if you like, to producing cities as sites of consumption and circulation. Okay? Firstly, cities need a variety of services and consumer goods. Okay? So global cities that are going to operate as such need a variety of shops, theatres, restaurants, venues. Okay. Secondly, they need an aesthetics of physical setting. They need to be nice places to be. Okay, welcoming, open, nice public spaces, beautiful architecture. Okay, think about somewhere like Barcelona. Okay, which isn't a particularly big city, but has a claim to being a global city based on its aesthetics. Okay. Thirdly, they've got to have good public services. Okay, and as part of that, they've got to allow speed of movement around the city. Okay, to allow people to consume, you need to allow a speed of movement to produce that moving between home, spaces of consumption, and spaces of work. Okay, so good public services is partly about good public transport. Now it's this that I really want to stress, this 4th point. A key point for urban geographers is that the way London becomes a global city, or became a nodal point for the flow of capitalism, was by generating the speed and efficiency of movement, okay, around the networks of consumption. So for people like Asher Min and Nigel Thrift, they basically debunk a lot of the myths around global cities, but they do say whatever else cities are about, they're unprecedentedly based on mobility. Okay, so mobility and circulation is all that cities are about. So London as a global city then enacts and directs that mobility as a key part of its ethos. Okay, a key part of the way it acts towards itself and others. Okay, and the great thing about London, as I've gone through in some of my earlier work, is that it kind of literally enacts that idea of circulation and mobility in its planning. Okay, so if you look at the London plan, the London spatial plan, everything is focused. So when we talk about London as a global city, this is Greater London or Outer London. This is Inner London, and this is what they call the Central Activity Zone. Okay, within the London spatial plan of 2009. Okay, Now, when we talk about London as a global city, what we're really talking about is this central activity zone. Everything is centred on here. All transport comes from and ends in the central activity zone. All the major, what they call the major town centres of international importance, all the major cultural zones, all the nighttime economy hotspots are centred in this central activity zone. Okay, and the aim of the transport is to public transport system is to get you to and around and then away from this activity zone as quickly and efficiently as possible, so that you can consume as much and as well as you can. Okay. So when we're talking about London's ethos as a global city, what we're talking about is this zone here, the central activity zone. Okay, we're not talking about this deprived section of inner London, which is characterised by quite a lot of destitution and urban problems, or suburban outer London. We're talking about the central activity zone. Okay, this is the area where London enacts its ethos, its way of being. Okay, so now after that kind of brief digression into urban geography, I wanted to ask then, how did Occupy fit into all this? Why is Occupy an interesting form of resistance, okay, to and an interesting ethos, okay? And I wanted to go back to Giles Fraser here. So if London as global city enacts this ethos of circulation and mobility, Occupy is doing the opposite, okay? It does the opposite right in the middle of the central activity zone. So St Paul's is around here, okay, right in the centre of the central activity zone. So it's doing the opposite of circulation and mobility right in the centre of that zone. As Giles Fraser says, Occupy is stubbornly about the physical reality of space. Others may write books and organise seminars. Occupy puts up tents. It takes up space. It is there, okay? So Occupy dwells, okay, and seizes space in order to halt, okay, to simply be, and thereby not circulate, explicitly not circulate, not consume, okay. So someone like W.J.T. Mitchell talks about Occupy as a social movement that is characterised by immobility. That's why it's interesting, right? Occupy dwells in and seizes space in order to simply be, okay. Its ethos is one of resistance to the ethos of the global city. It's a performative ethics, a performative resistance. Okay, it performs its resistance by what it is, but it's a performance that doesn't really do anything beyond occupying space. But it's space that's meant for mobility and circulation, for moving to and from spaces of consumption. And in that way, it's kind of borrowing from this key group of revolutionaries. In the, well, they started in the 50s, I think, called the Situationists, okay? And these guys were kind of central to the Paris 1968 protests, which none of us remember because we're far too young. So these guys were about bending space towards different ends to that which it was intended for, okay? And they're a key influence, especially of Occupy Wall Street, the Situationists. So what these guys are doing is bending space against what it is meant to do. So Occupy stopping, its dwelling, its being there is disruptive without needing to enact any other form of disruption other than being, as it is. So it's not, so people like Elizabeth Cobbett and Randall Germain compare Occupy to the Stop the City demonstrations, which were in the 80s, 83, 84. Okay, these guys literally tried to blockade the stock exchange, okay, and the financial district of London. They literally tried to stop the city, to stop its circulation and its mobility through a kind of violence, okay. Occupy doesn't do that. It doesn't try and kind of blockade anything. It's rather, it's more a kind of critical ethos in Foucault's sense, okay? A critical, resistant counter-conduct which aims not to be governed like that, by that, in the name of those principles, with such and such an objective in mind, and by means of such procedures, not like that, not for that, not by them, okay? So this kind of seizing and dwelling is an ethics as resistance, okay? and it's kind of enticing for the fact that it doesn't produce a set of demands or a set or a program or a party is what is most enticing about it for some people like Richard Grusin and Bernard Harcourt. But it's deeply disappointing for other people. People like Slavoj Žižek, okay, the kind of the traditional left. Although Žižek's not really traditional leftist, but it's what's disappointing about Occupy for the old left is that it doesn't produce a program and a list of demands. Okay, so someone like Maurice Glassman celebrates when Occupy London produced a list of demands of the Corporation of the City of London. But those demands were not fully endorsed by the movement and were really kind of parochial and kind of crap, to be honest. But I would tend to agree with those like Mitchell, Grusin and Tormey that not publishing such demands is what makes Occupy interesting. Okay, Harcourt says Occupy is politically disobedient in not trying to stop the city, in not publishing a program or a list of demands. Okay. In contrast to that, it's a form of what Mitchell calls expressive conduct that states a determination to remain and dwell. They say something by doing something. It's a reversal of speech act theory. So I don't know whether you guys know speech act theory. It's the idea that you do something by saying something. So when you're getting married, you say I do, and that by saying I do, you perform an action. Even though you're just saying something, you get married. And this is a reversal of that, okay? You're doing something, you're saying something by just doing something, by dwelling, okay? And that's what I think is potentially disruptive about the movement, okay? The key thing says that Occupy can't opt out of the circulations and flows of global capitalism, okay? It can never stop the city, it can never just opt out of consuming, okay? So you get this quite common critique of Occupy from people like Louise Mensch and the right-wing and liberal media, where they say, oh, they're queuing outside Starbucks, they're drinking Coke, they're buying fast food, okay? And they claim this is a kind of them selling out, the movement selling out. The point is that misses the point. These protesters can't opt out of global capitalism. Judith Butler says Occupy is about bodies occupying space, but it's about bodies, yeah? And bodies have material requirements. They need shelter, they need food, they need drink, okay? And you have no option when you're in the global city but to buy those that food and drink and shelter, okay? So you can't opt out of the circulation and flows of global capitalism, okay? Equally, what's interesting is that Occupy is taking advantage of the city's openness and its public spaces that are key to London's production of itself as a global city. Okay, if you think about here where we talked about the way a city becomes a space of consumption, this key bit, ethics of physical settings, okay, the aesthetics of physical settings, is about the openness of public space. It's about nice places to be, okay? Now what Occupy is doing is taking advantage of what makes a city a global city. Its openness, okay? Its welcomingness, its public spaces, okay? And crucially, the way it's governed at a distance, according to someone like Nicholas Rose. Okay, so cities aren't governed by dictatorships. They're not governed through disciplinary power. They're governed at a distance through nudging us in certain directions, through changing our behaviour in certain ways, by using bus lanes rather than making us take the bus, by using a congestion zone rather than forcing us onto trains. Okay, so so the way the city is governed at a distance without this kind of strong sovereign power means that Occupy can participate in that openness and take advantage of it, okay? It can't opt out of the way the city produces itself, but it takes advantage of it to kind of subvert it, okay? So Jodie Dean talks about how the aim of occupying everything is fundamentally problematic because we already occupy everything. Public space, by definition, is already occupied. Okay, but the point of Occupy London and the like is that it occupies space differently. The attempt is to occupy it with a different kind of critical ethos that, as we said, occupies differently. And this is the picture that was generated by the Culture Jammers, the Canadian magazine that called on the initial occupation of Wall Street. And this is the I think Goldman Sachs, is it Goldman Sachs ball? Is that right? Something like that, around Wall Street, the Wall Street ball anyway. And the images of a ballet dancer occupying space differently, okay? It remains complicit with the way global capitalism operates, because you cannot opt out of it, but you can resist it by negotiating it and occupying it differently, okay? So I think we can kind of illustrate that finally to kind of end with going back to Giles Fraser, okay, and the way Occupy London has tried to occupy space differently, okay. So shortly after resigning, Giles Fraser observed that the various criticisms of the movement tended to focus on it as Occupy as a magnet for the homeless and for drug addicts, okay. And he says that actually is no criticism at all. He says Occupy's welcome and care for the vulnerable contrasted sharply with the indifference of a city that didn't seem to give two hoots. Okay, so what Occupy is doing is telling us something about a different way of being within the global city. Okay, a different, more critical way of living. Okay, someone like there's a lot of overstatement about what Occupy is doing. Bernard Harcourt overstates it when he says that Occupy has tapped a deep well of solidarity and passion and community and has provoked a wide-scale political reawakening. Okay, there's nothing necessarily deep or wide-ranging about what Occupy is doing. Okay, my suspicions are that actually it's neither of those things. But what it does do is give a living workshop, as Mackenzie Ward puts it, of how to be differently. Okay. Jody Dean says, we already occupy everything, but the aim is to occupy it differently, occupy it for the benefit of the 99% rather than the 1%. So the key is that Occupy is not totally revolutionary, but it enacts a critical ethos that negotiates the governing techniques of advanced liberal capitalism. Okay, so that's it.